Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the board forum on the 2020 budget. Um, this evening, we'll have a presentation of the budget and an opportunity for questions. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Courtney. I always pronounce your last name incorrectly, Courtney. Desabaye?
Uh, Desiree, but yes, Marianne's actually going to do the presentation.
Oh, okay, all right.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, good evening, everyone. This is Marianne Cox, the Interim Chief Financial Officer. I'm going to go through the proposed operating budget. This is the same presentation as was presented to the boards on 4/21. This presentation has been available on the board website since that time. So we'll just go through it briefly and then try to address the questions that we've received. Many of them we can address right away, and some of them we'll have to get back to them. Okay. So the 21 school year budget is driven by the Blueprint for Success and the community feedback. We received feedback on the basis of surveys and community meetings. We held 4 district-wide community meetings, including focused on students. The priorities noted on this slide are student wholeness, literacy, and leadership. Okay, we need to recognize where we are. Certainly, the FY21 budget is being presented while the schools are closed. We're in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we have reacted with our best efforts to allow students to learn remotely. And City Schools is focused on supporting students and staff during distance learning, as well as looking forward to the time when students will return to the classroom. You know, our state funding, the Maryland legislature approved the recommendations of the Kirwan Commission, paving the way for a new funding formula, but that new funding formula will not apply to the 21 budget. Of course, we have many fiscal unknowns. The full financial impact of the coronavirus pandemic on both the state and the city and city schools are still unknown. So as we go along, should adjustments be required to the FY21 budget, we have a process by which amendments can be made to our budget, and it will go through the full approval gamut. Our presentation includes comments on our funding priorities, certainly literacy, including early literacy and the other literacy, you know, the higher grade level literacy is just as important. We have a priority for leadership, for transformational principles, and a reorganization within the OHC office to establish a new system learning and development department. We have equity priorities. We have priorities within enrollment choice and transferred with a renewed focus on improving the enrollment system. And the family and community engagement, we have the adoption of the dual capacity building framework for school family partnerships. We have funding priorities for career readiness. Joe, we're a couple slides down if you could, okay. For career readiness, we have a new 4-year career and technology education plan will be developed to prepare students with the skills to enter high-wage, high-skilled jobs. Implementation will begin in FY21 with a roadmap to create new programs, identify locations and staffing, and a new work-based learning team will ensure students have career experiences. We're continuing with the priority of safe, secure, and healthy schools. Will be prioritized for security and HVAC improvements through state and local funding based on assessments by the facility staff. And the building automation system will be expanded to give more current information, and a new training program for HVAC staff. We have a funding priority for staff recruitment. We will continue to prioritize recruiting high-quality candidates by expanding and consolidating the work of internal recruiters, hiring a new director of recruitment and selection, and piloting a hiring bonus program. We will maintain our partnerships with alternative teacher programs, including the Urban Teachers Residency Program and partnering with local colleges. So now we're going to just talk about the numbers for our budget. The revenue, of course, is based on enrollment to a large part, the enrollment as it flows through our various funding formulas. As you can see, our funded enrollment, this is the way city schools gets their funding from the Maryland State Department of Education. You can see that there were significant increases going back to FY16, but the funded enrollment from FY20 to FY21 is only decreasing from 73,580 to 73,533. So it's remaining close to level. Our total revenue allocation across all of our funds is $1.388 billion. That's general funds funding of $1.172 billion. The special revenue fund, which is our grants, of $161.7 million, and our enterprise funds, which is the food services operation, of $54.5 million. When you look at the general fund, the revenue breakdown, you can see that the bulk of the money is received from the state revenue according to those funding formulas that are affected primarily by enrollment and wealth, and that's relative wealth to the rest of the state. That can affect how much we get. As you look at the total for FY20 to FY21, you can see an increase from $1.162 billion to $1.172 billion. However, please note that the FY20 budget was adopted before city schools and the rest of the state was advised that they would get the teacher grant, the teacher salary incentive grant. So that was about $8.4 million. So that is the bulk of the increase from FY20 to FY21. We had state revenue increased by roughly $8.4 million for the teacher salary grant. The city of Baltimore revenue increased about 8.9% due to the maintenance of effort requirements and including the escalator. Other revenue increased by about $750,000 due to investment income, and the fund balance contribution decreased from 22 million down to 15.3 million, which is a $6.7 million decrease. So overall, the increase was about the $10 million, which was the sum of all of those variables netted. The FY20 versus FY21 state revenue comparison. Now, this is general fund. You can see that there's a lot of pluses and minuses. The foundation program increased by 2.5 million. The transportation grant was relatively stable. Compensatory education increased by 2.5 million. Now, the limited English proficiency grant increased by 7.9 million, primarily due to our increase in the LEP enrollment. The declining enrollment grant decreased by 10.5 million. The declining enrollment grant was a special grant that was enacted a few years ago, and it smooths the effect of declining enrollment over a 3-year average. So it's just the way the calculation occurred that led to that decrease, because one of the highest declines was included in that 3-year average that was included in the calculation for FY20. So another thing that increased was the decrease was a hold harmless adjustment. This was an adjustment that the governor added that he did not have to, that was not required by our funding regulations, but he did that so that overall the general fund revenue would not decrease. So we certainly appreciate that. The non-public projections declined by 1.4 million, primarily because of our non-public expenditures were going down. So the total state revenue projected increased by about 7.1 million, which is the sum of all those changes that I just described. The special revenue fund, people call it grants, restricted fund, you can see it's 115 million for FY21. And certainly we are most appreciative of this money. As you can see, most of this money are the entitlement grants, Title I, Title II, IDEA, or special ed, third-party billing. This allows us to fund supplementary services. These are not allowed to be spent on essential services or services that are required to provide free and appropriate public education. These are supplemental services, and they are provided according to the student needs. And so that's how we spend it. But City Schools is very appreciative of getting this money for the grants. Now we have a little more specific money, a little more specific information on the Title I. You can see the amounts are there from FY16 to FY21, from $48 million in FY16 to $56 million in FY21. And then there is a calculation that allows for how the money gets allocated to the schools. There are certain things that we need to take care of, including allocations to not public schools. And, we also fund some district-wide programs, and then we send the money to the individual schools so that the principals may select how they spend that money. Okay, for other revenue sources, we have the enterprise fund, which is the food services fund, and you can see that's relatively level, 55.3 million to 54.6 million. The other financing sources, that's the money that we use to balance the budget. It's the gap between the revenue sources that we have and the expenditures that we're trying to expend. And we are fortunate that we can fund them through the use of assigned fund balance. So that would be money that City Schools has accumulated on their books, an excess of revenue over expenditures through the years, and it's a cumulative amount. So general fund allocations overall of the 1.172 billion. We have allocations, direct school allocations of 793 million, and centrally budgeted allocations of 379 million. And certainly a significant portion of the centrally budgeted allocations relate to services provided to the schools. So for the $793 million, we spend $347 million for fair student funding at traditional schools. We have locked funds of $217 million. That's generally students with disabilities of $113 million, and general education locked positions of around $104 million. And that would include ESOL, ROTC, PTAC, pre-K, those kinds of locked positions, where then they are distributed to the schools. The services are provided to the schools based on need. The charter allocations are $133 million. Unlocked student with disabilities, that's $77 million. That's funding given to the schools so that the principals may serve the needs of their special ed population there. They are closest to the students, so they would have a good idea of where to spend that money. The alternative option programs are $15.7 million, and targeted funding is $2.9 million. That's the IB program, money given to School for the Arts, money that's helped to balance school budgets when because of the size or enrollment of the schools. It's difficult for them to provide all the services that they need to provide. So that's the 793 million. The next slide gives us a schedule of our adopted and final funding for traditional schools and charter schools. And you can see how the money can go up or down. The most significant variable that will affect this is the enrollment adjustments that occur in the fall. When we take the actual enrollment at 9:30, we do an enrollment adjustment for the schools, so that's why the numbers would change. Okay, then we have the district office allocations, and you can see that it went down slightly, about $3 million from FY20 to FY21. There's a lot of pluses and minuses in this one. The non-public decreased, indirect cost increase. You know, it's just a lot of pluses and minuses. We have our fringe went down, our contingency went down, utilities stayed flat. So all in all, the entire district office allocation only went down by about 3 million. But we need to remember that many of these services are provided to the schools, like the COO office that has transportation in it, you know, human capital, there's, you know, personnel related services that are provided to all the schools. Okay. So that is our run through of the slides. Then we have received some questions in advance, and some of them we can answer right away, and some of them we'll have to provide some of the response later. We had received a question from Akeisha Goodwin, and she was asking for what is the per pupil for ESOL, special ed, Title I, and high risk students. And in terms of how we answer that, what I can tell you is what City Schools receives as the beginning part of the calculation, because there are adjustments in the state funding formula. But for the limited English proficiency, we start out with the LEP enrollment times a funding amount of $3,629 per student. So then that amount goes through a series of calculations, you know, which is specified in the state funding, that you know, there's adjustments for whether or not we use the September net taxable income for our LEA versus the November one, or if there's a TIF adjustment. But there's a minimum grant, and then whichever of the calculations turns out to be in City Schools' best interest, that's the amount they fund. So the total amount that we got for LEP is $3,629, and that, just as a raw calculation, would have resulted in $36.9 million. But because of the calculations that we go through, City Schools ended up getting $35.4 million, which we then use for this student population on the basis of their need. We provide the services to the students where they are. The special ed is another similar thing. This is not included in the fair student funding, but our basic, the amount that City Schools gets from the state is $2,712 per special ed student. For FY21, we have an estimated population of 12,545 students, which would result in a special ed unadjusted revenue of $49.7 million. Again, it goes through the series of calculations. Remember, it's not just enrollment, it's wealth as well, relative wealth. So by the time we have the final calculation, again, the state gives us the calculation that provides the best result for city schools, and we get $46 million through the funding for the special education student. Ms. Goodwin also asked about Title I. Title I, the money that city schools received is based on census information and does not come to us as a per pupil. There are calculations that we do internally to take care of certain items that we have to, and then we have the district and the district programs, and then the money that goes to the schools. For Ms. Keisha's interest, there will be 2 files that will be posted to our site tomorrow. One is the FY21 Title I FAQs, and then the other is the Title I Part A funding. It's the FY21 Title I funding overview. So it will explain in much more detail how City Schools gets the money, how we allocate it, what's its purpose, and how we apply that funding. Now, we would need clarification from Ms. Goodwin on high risk. She asked for the per pupil for high risk, and we would need that to be defined because I'm not certain of the reference. So we could follow up with that. We also received some questions from Commissioner Roberts. And the first question there was on page 10 of the budget book. There are 77,913.5 total students. And the question related to how can you have a 0.5 student? Clearly, we have full people. But when MSDE funds us, the partial FTEs relate to adjustments for part-time students. So that's how we end up with FTEs that are not whole numbers for student enrollment. There was a question on the reserve set aside on page 18 indicate a number of $7,000 and $7 million actually. And the question was basically what is it? It is that relates to the vacancy factor that we take into account during our calculation, which we know the vacancy factor does occur. So this will allow us to expend our monies in a more expedited manner, and that way we give the benefit of that to the schools. I agree with the commissioner that we should not have put the word all in that, because that adjustment relates to it does not relate to the charter schools, it relates to the traditional schools because the fundings are different. Okay. And then on page 48, the general fund centrally funded FTE central office grew by 90 FTE, and they were asking for a breakout of the new positions and where they align with the district's priority. I want to make a correction that schedule on page 48 should not have said the general fund centrally funded FTEs. It should have just been the centrally funded FTEs, because there's another schedule on page 49 right after it that breaks it down by office by whether it's grant funded or general fund funded, but it accounts for all those FTEs. I would ask if Jeremy Grant Skinner is on the call, if he could perhaps speak a little bit about how the increase in FTEs would relate to the funding priorities.
Sure, thanks, Marianne. So I would start with about half of the additional FTEs that are in a district office budget are in the communications, engagement, and enrollment office. And we've shared previously that this is mostly community school site specialists that were actually added during the FY20 year after new grant funds became available for that purpose. And those were concentrations of poverty grant funds. that required our schools to schools receiving those funds to have those positions. So 42 new community school site specialists, and then there are community school specialists and a community schools manager position that were added to support the work of those 42 folks in the field. So that was for communications, engagement, and enrollment. Another office that you see some increase is the achievement and accountability office. And this is because that office expanded and is expanding its grant support, additional allocations from state grants. You know, the management, monitoring, and reporting requirements of those grants come along with it. So the grant new comprehensive support and improvements that are for the schools that have gone through a process to identify root causes of challenges they're facing, so that they can use these grant funds to support addressing those challenges. And again, the OA team has staff to support those grant. Is the concentrations of poverty grant and Title I Analyst Center grant manager to support that work. The academics office shows an increase on that chart on page 48. There is no as much of a significant change, as much as there are several departments that have added some new positions. These include adding a second position where previously we only had one person in the district office working on the athletics program district-wide. Several new climate coaches in the student homeless department to support our additional coaches for MTSS or some FTEs are positions that are going to focus on early literacy and ESOL. And in that last case, we've shared, you know, this past year, there was a very significant increase in our ELL population and the need to expand our programming, our ESOL programming. And we expect that to continue in the upcoming year as well. And the last office or division that shows up on chart 48 with an increase is the operations office, and most of the increase there comes from an addition in the FY21 budget of bus as we continue as a district to try to expand our in-house capacity for transportation in an effort to balance the of in-house transportation and vendor transportation.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Just for everyone's information, we will adjust the title that was incorrectly titled on page 48, and we'll make the adjustment on the word all to make our budget book reflect what it should. Our apologies for the incorrect information. We just received another set of questions, just you know, within the last half hour. Some of them we can address right off, but there's some others that we will have to post a response to our board site. The first question was, does the board expect local revenues to decline due to the current condition of the local economy? Concerning FY21, City Schools has received no indication from the City of Baltimore that they would apply for a relief for maintenance of effort. Our funding formulas, both state and local, are set in legislation. And there are ways to change that, but in the absence of following the ways to change it, the funding formulas stay the way they are. So the The funding from the appropriation from the city of Baltimore is expected to remain the same, which, they meet the maintenance of effort, including the escalator factors for FY21. All right, the second question is, does the board expect there to be any COVID-19 related costs, whether that be increases in food expenditures, expanding distance learning capabilities, etc.? If so, does the FY21 budget account for these costs, and how large could these costs potentially be? Well, certainly we have had COVID-19 related costs, and they didn't wait for FY21. We're incurring them right now. We are incurring costs in cleaning supplies and in providing the educational packets. We are incurring a decrease in food revenue. It's not so much an increase in the expenditures, it's a decrease in the revenue because our students are not in school, and so we would not get the revenue from a school-based student meal program. We are also incurring costs to expand distance learning capabilities. We are buying devices. We are providing distance learning on TV and, by Google, internet. Certainly we're incurring some costs there, but we're incurring them now. The future of returning to the classroom is uncertain. So we can't say for sure exactly when the changes will stop and then the new way of learning will commence. But we did not include anything specific in the FY21 budget for those COVID-related expenditures because we didn't have that knowledge when it occurred. But again, we have prescribed means by which we can reallocate funding. We have budget amendments that must be board approved. We submit them to the board. We collect the information. We decide what expenditures are best for city school students and the district, and we propose them to the board, and the board reviews and approves them. So we have a means by which we can reallocate our funding should we find this distance learning situation extends into the new year. Another question is, does the board feel that there will be enough federal stimulus to offset any potential decreases in state and local revenues? We have been advised that there's two, I'm sure there'll be more, but there is like FEMA money that we can apply for, and then there's the CARES Act funding. Just last Friday, we received the application from MSDE so that city schools may determine how they would like to strategically spend the CARES money. And so we have to put an application together. We submit it for approval, and then once the management and the board have agreed on how we might ask to use that funding, then we will submit it to MSDE for their review. So enough to offset potential decreases in state and local revenues. It's difficult to determine whether it's enough, but certainly I believe that it was about 48 million that we received under the CARES Act, under the allocation that was given to us. And we may use that money for anything that qualifies under Title I, Title II, Title III, Title IV, Title V, for any of those uses. And there's not a supplanting requirement in this, so we can spend the money on any of those costs. So we city schools have to put together a strategic plan on how to use that money. And then we also have the capability to apply for reimbursement from FEMA for some of the COVID-related expenditures that we've incurred to date.
Marianne, could I just step in for a minute? I do think that, thank you. I do think it's important for the board and the public to note, as Marianne just referenced, but I want to amplify a bit, that one, given that we do not know the full landscape of costs coming, And two, we do not know the full landscape of what the state and federal aid will look like. I think it's one of these questions we're going to have to continually update. And I'll just give an example. We do not know what the ongoing cost, for example, of personal protective equipment will be. We have no idea ongoing what kind of 6 to 8 months out that might look like as the landscape changes. We are still computing costs for whatever technological plan we put in place for students that, frankly, heretofore had not been a district-wide top-level priority in terms of district purchasing. Clearly, schools did in previous years, but the current landscape, as Marianne referenced, has already pushed us to think about expenditures from a district perspective that we had not previously. So I just want to stress that Marianne correctly references the existing pots of money, but I will tell you from a national perspective, both for the public and for the board, that what is becoming increasingly clear, at least across some of the national conversations that I am having with other superintendents, with national legislatures, that there is going to need to be decisions made about future investments in K-12 nationally, given some of what the prospective landscape looks like. And that is even before we get into discussions of what might be happening with our own state funding. So I just wanted to emphasize that Marianne clearly has been doing a great job on the budget overview, but I think it's important for people to know that we've been managing well. But for example, our school lunch program, as Marianne noted, is going to be impacted by the fact that we are only serving about 1/10 or 1/9 of the revenue generating meals that we normally do, which could mean a loss in the ballpark of 25 to 27 or $28 million. And that's just looking at what we're looking at now. So I did want to just emphasize that because I think it's important for the public and the board to just keep in mind what Marianne, I think, rightly recognized and referenced, but wanted to make sure that I punctuated that a bit. Thank you, Marianne.
All right, thank you. Thank you. The last question from the last series of questions that we received was, does the 21 budget expect changes in funding from the new funding formula under the Kerwin recommendations? And our response to that is no, that the Kerwin was scheduled to commence with FY22, so the FY21. I mean, we do have the blueprint money, certainly, but not pure Kerwin funding. And then it says, is it likely the amendment in the recommendations that say that funding increases would be put on hold? The state revenues decline by 7.5% will be implemented. And if so, when would city schools expect the new funding formulas to be implemented? That one we will need input from other areas to be able to answer that kind of question.
Yeah, and likewise, I would just add on to what Marianne said about that. That we have been in close communication with our delegation, with the Baltimore City delegation around this. And I have to say they have been very good about kind of keeping contact with us and communication flowing. And clearly they too are navigating kind of the new financial landscape as well. But so that the board knows we have regular calls, regular communication with members of the Baltimore City delegation.
Yes, and we have regularly scheduled calls with people like Council of Great City Schools. Many of the different phases of the Council of Great City Schools were receiving updated information from them as well as MSDE. We've been on USDE calls. Dr. Santolisa is on the superintendent's calls. We try to get as much updated information as we can. So those are all of the questions that I believe we've received prior to the board meeting. Are there any additional questions that the board commissioners might have, or that some of our attendees might have?
I just want to add to your last statement about the calls. Board members have also been a part of some calls that have been happening with other local boards as well as the state board. So yeah, the communication is flowing. I have a message that there were 2 questions. Mr. Gant, do you have those? Have they already been dealt with?
Marianne addressed those, so they've been addressed.
Okay, and we did not have anyone else who signed up beyond that?
No, we didn't.
Okay, so is there a board member that has an additional question or comment at this time?
Sorry, I was on mute. This is Commissioner Frank. Sorry. Just waving my hand around. One question is, you referenced something called the bonus retention plan, or we're piloting a new bonus retention plan. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Okay. Yeah, well, Jeremy and Skinner, yes. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Sure. Hi. Thanks, Commissioner Frank. So we included some funding in the budget to I mean, you said it pilot. The purpose of this is to test out whether we can increase our effectiveness in recruiting veterans from other with a initiative that they would receive our higher.
Jeremy, you're fading in and out.
Can you hear me?
No.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
No.
Oh, no, it went out again.
I can take it offline.
That
I
may
said
be
that.
one in writing.
Yeah, and I'll take it in writing. That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
And the other question I wanted to ask,
Right.
Marianne, the budget book that we have, this is not the only budget book, right? Is there a far more detailed budget book that's used by the school district, or is this it?
No, that's the only budget book that we have. I think you might be referencing to, if you went back like 10 years or so ago, it used to be much thicker. But in the last, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years, we've refined it to include certain information. If there's some information that you'd like to have, if you would let us know, we'd be happy to provide it.
Sometimes I'm used to seeing budget books that are more concise, that don't always tie budgeting to metrics and outcomes. So I'm imagining there's decisions that are made that are reflected in this budget book that are tied back to investments outside the blueprint. That's been articulated, but outside the blueprint, where are we investing in greater efficiencies? Where are we investing in these programs that are working? Where are we disinvesting in things that are not working? And that's sometimes reflected in the document, so we can see the sort of values that are behind this in terms of the decisions that are behind this in terms of how this $1.4 billion budget is being spent. And we have a little taste of that throughout the budget book, but from my perspective, it's not really enough. So I have some more questions that I'll just submit in writing to try to get a better sense of where, how some of this decision making was made, and to the degree to which it's based in metrics and things that we're trying to measure year to year from time to time.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Are there any other
Is
questions?
there anyone? Okay, if not, then I'm going to suggest that if anyone else has questions, whether it's a board member or a member of the public, to please send those in writing. You can, I think you can send them to the care of the board office. We will see that they get to the appropriate folks for responses. We will post responses, and I believe the budget book is available for folks to take a look at. It's also posted on board docs, and if we have no other questions and that is it for the evening, then I'm going to tell everyone to have a good evening and please be safe. A reminder that we will still be looking at questions and trying to answer those. The expected date for the board to vote on this budget is May the 12th. Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.